1994. I then went to the Shire of Melton in 1995, and I left council to set up my own practice in about 1997, and I've been doing it since then. One of the things that I found very professionally rewarding was that I was asked to become a sessional member of Planning Panels Victoria, and thank you to Helen Gibson and Kathy Mitchell for the opportunity to do that. And I was also a former member of the ResCode Advisory Committee, which was established to comment on the state government's draft ResCode proposals, which ultimately ended up in all planning schemes in Victoria. So, firstly, before I kick onto the agenda, I'd like to thank my colleague Matthew Gilbertson for assisting me in preparing these slides and for doing some of the research as part of this program. These things are time consuming, and I really appreciate Matt's efforts in putting those slides together. That said, any errors of fact, I take full responsibility for. And I should also say too that the views that I express here are my own. They are not in any way endorsed by DELP or any other planning agency. So what are we going to do today? Well, I thought what we'd do is we'd talk a bit about neighbourhood character from an historical perspective. That is, how did we get here? What were the policies, reviews, and background that led to the establishment of this concept called neighbourhood character? Having got here, how's it working? What are the advantages and disadvantages of our current approach? What can we learn from the experience? And lastly, can we do it better? Now, for the younger planners out there, it's appropriate to note that neighbourhood character hasn't been with us forever. In fact, the residential design assessment frameworks that we use today are reasonably new in the scheme of things, and even at some stage, medium density development in the form of some of the flat developments that you see on the scheme now were approved really without a planning permit, just with a building permit. There was a tremendous amount of debate, I guess, at the time as to the appropriateness of that form of development and the impact that it was having on Melbourne streets and suburbs. And in some respects, that form of development, which was really designed according to mathematical metrics, led to quite a significant development boom in that form of housing. This screenshot here shows medium and high density dwelling approvals as a proportion of total approvals in Melbourne between 1956-57 to 2011-2012. And what you can see, if you can see my cursor, is a significant increase in the total proportion of approvals of medium and higher density housing developments, peaking in that late 1960s, early 1970 period, which was really coincided with that flat boom, those 60s walk-up flats that we still see dotted around Melbourne's particularly inner urban suburbs. You can see that that boom peaked at around about 1968 and then started to decline over the 70s up until the 1980s, when local councils were able to introduce their own flat codes, which then started to see a drop-off in the proportion of new housing starts comprising of medium to higher density housing. Now, that trough continued up until the early 90s, and as we'll see, the increase in the proportion of medium density housing starts coincided with the release of a couple of government documents that were connected to planning schemes at the time that took a more permissive, some might say, or performance-based approach to the planning and assessment of medium density housing development in Melbourne suburbs. Now, for those of you who aren't as old as me, you might not remember these front covers of these documents, but on the left is the Victorian Code for Residential Development for multi-dwellings, known as Vic Code 2, colloquially. And on the right-hand side is the Good Design Guide. The Good Design Guide was the document that came after the Vic Code 2 document. And both of these documents were introduced into the Victorian system really as a way of facilitating the development of medium density development in Victoria. And the hallmark of both documents is that they took a performance-based approach to the assessment of medium density development rather than an approach characterised by mandatory settings for things like setback or density or height or those types of things. Now, these documents were each in their own way relatively controversial because what they did was they tended to centralise power in the department, particularly in terms of the department's ability to set rules for medium density development and to limit the capacity of local governments to develop their own approaches based on their own local circumstances, political demands and the like. Vic Code 2 was reviewed by a review panel in December 1994. Now, some names from that 1994 document, people today might be still familiar. Tony James and Gail Sands. Now, one thing that that review panel found was that the Vic Code 2 document had a focus not on neighbourhood character, but on streetscape, the appearance of the buildings as they presented to the public realm. Now, that led to a view amongst people in the profession, and a view that I think was accepted by the panel, about the need to broaden the concept of character away from a limitation on the way the buildings presented to the streetscape towards a broader conception of the way the buildings sat, say, within a landscape context, or within a broader conception of the site itself. So concepts such as the feel of an area, or the perception of the development, not only from the street, but from the backyard, became an idea that was considered to be important if medium density development was to be accepted broadly by the Victorian community. The review panel too, I think, understood that there were some elements of character that could be quantified, and those things might be matters such as, well, setback or height, but other elements of character were more subjective and harder to characterise, say, through a formula or a metric. But nevertheless, the advisory, the review panel considered that those matters were relevant because it felt, in its own words, that the erosion of that type of character was arousing community disquiet about medium density housing, and that if that sort of housing was to be provided in a way which meets government policy and community needs, it must be acceptable to the community. And for this to occur, it must be respectful of its context. Now, the committee was at pains to point out that that does not mean that the community should expect there to be no change to streets and backyards. So the review of Vic Code 2 led to the introduction of the concept of neighbourhood character and the development of the Good Design Guide. The Good Design Guide was first printed in July 1995, and you might also get the sense that, well, if they're printing the Good Design Guide, it certainly mustn't form part of planning schemes, and indeed that's the case. The Good Design Guide was a standalone document that sat outside of the planning scheme, but was called up much in the same way that reference documents are called up today. Now, you'll see that element 3 of the Good Design Guide was titled Neighbourhood Character, and it had 4 objectives. They were to achieve medium density development which is respectful of its neighbourhood, relevantly, to encourage innovative contemporary designs which make a positive contribution to the character of the neighbourhood, to maintain the garden character of neighbourhoods, and to incorporate trees with spreading crowns into developments. Now, in addition to those objectives, there were a series of criteria, and the criteria are similar to the standards that we see in clause 55 today. And criteria E3C1 was that medium density development among established housing, I think that term is important and relevant to note, should be designed to respect the character of the neighbourhood. And then there were some design suggestions that accompanied that. Now, for those of you who were practicing then or as students of history, you will appreciate that the Good Design Guide in its day was an evolutionary concept only. It evolved from Vic Code 2, but in terms of its impact on communities, that impact was far more revolutionary than evolutionary. It was a very controversial document in its day, perhaps because of this document, or perhaps because of other macro and microeconomic factors, or perhaps because of other political debates that were existing in the community at the time. The Good Design Guide became an incredibly controversial document. And simultaneously with the release of the Good Design Guide, we started to see the emergence of suburban activist groups like Save Our Suburbs, Richmond Raid, Residents Against Inappropriate Development, and so on, start to establish themselves, partly in response to the sorts of developments that were being facilitated by codes like the Good Design Guide. Now, coincidentally too, there was certainly pressure on the state government at the time on a whole range of fronts, and planning became a political issue at the state level. This led to the then Labor opposition to develop a policy in opposition, which it called a sensible balance. And that sensible balance foreshadowed the construction of a single residential code that would deal with all types of residential development. Now, the emergence of ResCode as the assessment tool arose as a consequence perhaps of a couple of perceptions in the community. The first perception was that the Good Design Guide was not dealing adequately with the issue of neighbourhood character. Reason for that view was that in the operation of the Good Design Guide, the various objectives were not mandatory, and that decision makers could effectively trade off one objective for another, leading to outcomes perhaps in the view of some that issues like neighbourhood character were given lesser significance, say to something like dwelling density, which was another component of the Good Design Guide. Similarly too, I think that there was a view perhaps that single dwellings were not being properly considered by the planning scheme as well, and that led to a view that perhaps there needed to be a review undertaken of the role of the Good Design Guide and the place that it played within the planning system. Now, following the election of the Labor opposition to government, the Department of Infrastructure, as it then was, released what we've come to know as ResCode for consultation purposes. There were two documents that were released by the Department of Infrastructure at the time. One was a commentary document on the draft residential code, and the second document was the code itself. Pardon me. Now, an element of the exhibited code was that it said that the new residential code and this commentary have been developed to fulfil the government's policy commitment to produce a single housing code to replace Vic Code 1 and the Good Design Guide, and to elevate and make mandatory the role of neighbourhood character in the assessment of new housing development. The code went on to say that neighbourhood character is to be the mandatory starting point for the assessment of residential development under the new code. So the purpose of ResCode, at least in the draft form of the document, was to elevate and make mandatory the concept of neighbourhood character as the starting point for all residential development assessment. Now, this was critical, really, because instead of a scenario whereby one could trade off character against other goals and objectives, one had to, in the new system, achieve all objectives, and this meant achieving neighbourhood character as part of that assessment matrix. Now, the exhibited code was considered by the Residential Code Review Advisory Committee on the 19th of December 2000, and again, shout out to the members of that committee. I was fortunate enough to be part of that committee, and it was, for me, really a career-defining moment, and I feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to have been part of that experience. The changes that were recommended by the advisory committee were revolutionary at the time, but today and today have really stood the test of time, I think, due to their flexibility and ability to deal with all circumstances across the state. A key component of the approach recommended by the advisory committee was to embed the residential development controls within planning schemes across Victoria. And so now, rather than ResCode be a document that stands outside of the planning scheme, it now forms part of every planning scheme at clauses 54, 55, 56 and 58. You'll notice now that neighbourhood character sits at clause 5502-1 of every planning scheme, that it has 2 neighbourhood character objectives, and then a series of standards at standard B1 and a series of decision guidelines that accompany the standards. Now you'll notice the extract from the character practice note prepared by the state government on the left-hand side of the screen. And what that says is that in accordance with those 3 clauses, neighbourhood character is the starting point for the assessment of all residential development applications through the neighbourhood and site description or site and context descriptions, the design response, and the application of the neighbourhood character standards. Now, relevantly, thinking was that those objectives would be sufficient for most councils to deal with the issue of neighbourhood character without resort to supplementary documents such as neighbourhood character studies and the like. And the practice note said that a neighbourhood character study is therefore not necessary to ensure that neighbourhood character is properly considered through the development approval process in every case. While a neighbourhood character study can help, it is not a substitute for understanding a neighbourhood and site description on a site-by-site basis for all planning applications for residential development. So we're now in a situation where the statutory framework requires that all objectives be met. And those of you who do this for a living will appreciate that the achievement of the neighbourhood character objective is a mandatory requirement in the case of all developments that are accessible under this framework. So, okay, I guess by now we get that neighbourhood character is important, but what is it? Well, it's subjective. Neighbourhood character as a concept is perhaps one of the most argued about concepts in any residential development assessment, whether that's at the local government level or at the VCAT level. People have tried to define neighbourhood character, and there's a number of definitions on the screen in front of you now. The first one is from the practice note. The second one is from the ResCode Advisory Committee report from 2000. Essentially, though, when we're trying to understand neighbourhood characteristics, then perhaps the most simple way to do that is to simply look at an area and then ask yourself, well, what is it about that area that makes it different or distinct from another area? In doing that exercise of comparative analysis, we're then usually able to understand what the neighbourhood characteristics of that area are, and then in our own mind build up a picture as to whether or not the proposed development will be respectful of those characteristics or whether it won't. So a way of perhaps understanding neighbourhood characteristics might be to compare areas that are quite contrasting. Say, look at, I don't know, the inner suburb of Richmond compared to the middle ring suburb of Templestowe. What is it about Richmond that makes it different or distinct? And we can typically understand that by way of comparing it to another area that's different to that area. So in the case of Richmond, say, the fact that the properties are set close to the street with small or no gardens, with low permeable front fences, with buildings built flush to side boundaries, typically with large lengths of boundary wall, with buildings that comprise a fine grain of detail in terms of, say, their subdivision pattern or elevational treatments. That will help us understand, okay, well, that's characteristic of Richmond, and we can compare that to, say, somewhere like Templestowe, whereby the opposite characteristics are probably reflected in that area. In that area, we would expect to see large front setbacks, established front gardens, potentially development set off one or both side boundaries, projecting garages where car accommodation is a more dominant element of the front elevation, typically a two-storey scale, and large backyards are all built form characteristics of an area like Templestowe. So when we do that comparative analysis, we can then start to see whether or not what is it that makes those that area of Richmond different or distinct from an area like Templestowe. And then, of course, we could imagine if we substituted a development that would be acceptable in Richmond into Templestowe, we could quite easily see how inappropriate that outcome would be from a character perspective. So that's a very quick summary, I guess, of what neighbourhood character means in a planning context. Now, of course, what we understand character to be in a planning context is often very different from what a community person, representative group might think of character. They might expand character to issues around the people who live in an area, or other kind of socio-economic or demographic considerations. And the planning system has taken great lengths really to make it clear that those types of matters are not planning considerations, and they're matters really that the planning system doesn't concern itself with from the perspective of neighbourhood character. Really until recently too, the planning system quite clearly took the view that dwelling density was not a consideration when it came to neighbourhood character, although clearly different dwelling densities might lead to different built form outcomes. That issue of dwelling density was made somewhat more cloudy recently when the state government decided to impose effectively dwelling limits through the neighbourhood residential zone. But with the removal of the dwelling cap, I think we can safely now say that dwelling density is not a consideration when it comes to neighbourhood character. But things like built form, scale, siting, spacing, the presence or absence of vegetation, fencing styles, those sorts of matters are all relevant considerations when it comes to an assessment of neighbourhood character. So another way really of understanding neighbourhood character and the way it's constructed in the Victorian system at the moment is to imagine neighbourhood character as a theoretical framework for managing change in an urban environment. Now, by that I mean we will often use neighbourhood character in different ways to achieve different built form outcomes. housing strategy in particular allows us to understand the sort of character outcomes that we might be seeking. And so, for instance, in a context where strategically we're envisaging little change, we will probably adjust the character settings accordingly to ensure that the built form outcomes reflect that setting. So here we might be doing things like limiting height, being more respectful of existing setbacks in new developments, being more respectful in terms of the placement of new development on sites than we would in an area where we're expecting to see significant change. So one of the things that we've been able to do as an industry to date has been to use character as a mechanism of regulating the pace and form of built form change, and to limiting that pace and to aligning that pace and form of change with an area's strategic settings. Now that really can be quite tricky to people because remember, we'll be using the neighbourhood character objective to achieve that aim of either limiting the pace of change or increasing the pace of change. And we do that through the concept of existing versus preferred character. So many character policies, of course, set out a preferred character statement. And sometimes that preferred character statement is really just an expression of the current character, but perhaps the current character with more trees or lower fences. And so in that respect, the establishment of a preferred character is really quite similar or consistent with the existing character. In other circumstances, we might use the idea of preferred character as a mechanism of really encouraging built form change and facilitating a new character. For that reason, the concept of character can get a little tricky, particularly amongst non-planners, whereby they might see, say, in an assessment in the residential growth zone, a requirement to apply the character objective to an assessment. But really what we're talking about there is achieving a preferred character rather than respecting an existing character. But that distinction in the statutory settings is often not clear. The other thing I think that we need to say about character is, look, as the postmodernists would say, it's a social construct. We've made it up. Our system could have chosen another terminology than neighbourhood character, or indeed it could have selected another technique for managing built form change. We've used it now for well over 20 years, but we don't have to continue to use it moving forward. So it's really just an idea that we've made up to achieve a particular strategic planning goal. So in planning schemes today, just looking at it from a systems approach, we've really seen planning schemes adopt essentially a belts and braces approach to the identification and management of built form and neighbourhood character through planning schemes. At the moment, there's really a multi-layered approach to the issue of neighbourhood character in planning schemes, and that layering you can see at state policy, in municipal strategic statements at clause 21, in local policies at clause 22, where a local policy is often partnered with a precinct, where they've taken a precinct approach and partnered with preferred character statements for each area. We're starting to see the advent of zone and overlay controls, and particularly the ability to insert neighbourhood character objectives into residential zones, as well as decision guidelines that might tell us what to think about in terms of built form assessments around the issue of neighbourhood character. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the concept of neighbourhood character studies and precinct brochures as either incorporated documents, like in the case of the Moonee Valley Planning Scheme, or as background or reference documents in the case of others. So that layering of approach really is quite unique in planning schemes, and you rarely see examples of other issues in planning schemes that have adopted such a sophisticated and complex approach to the management of a single issue. Now, there's a lot to like about the current system in some respects. It's certainly the most well-articulated issue really in any planning scheme. I think it'd go a long way to find another issue that has been dealt with so comprehensively, particularly in Melbourne's inner and middle ring suburbs, whereby there has been substantial investments in time and money in the industry's response to neighbourhood character as an issue. There is, to some extent, a level of clarity provided by the current approach, particularly in terms of the preferred character of an area. So an area's preferred character in contemporary planning schemes is really often defined fairly well. But of course, considerable debate remains about how that preferred character should be reflected in design. So in response to that subjectivity, many councils have adopted precinct brochures. Now, those precinct brochures attempt to add clarity to this otherwise murky concept. They're certainly of some assistance to a statutory planner. On the one hand, because they provide the planner with a list of planner and designer on a list of, in many cases, do's and don'ts. But I think as a profession too, we also see the consequences of the precinct brochure approach in assessments, particularly in that they tend to encourage a ticker box approach to character, and that ticker box approach is reflected not only by people in the statutory assessment side of the game, but also in the design side of the game as well, where people will design a development to meet the requirements of the precinct brochure. So in addition to the advantages of the current approach to character in planning schemes, there's clearly a number of disadvantages. A disadvantage of the existing system and the reliance on precinct brochures and character statements is that really they're often out of date by the time they enter planning schemes, or if they're not, they're very quickly overtaken by events. And I'm sure we've all seen examples of policies where the policy will refer to outdated metropolitan policies in the text, or where the precinct brochures are by now so old that the level of development that's occurred in the precinct has meant that what you see on the ground might not align with what you see in the brochure. And so there's a debate then, I think, about the relevance and applicability of those character precinct brochures and preferred character statements as a consequence. Now, of course, as professionals, we might accept that those differences are real and that the differences need to be accommodated in the way we do our assessment. But of course, third parties to the assessment process might not agree with that, and quite reasonably might expect that new development reflect the content of the preferred character statement or of the precinct brochure, despite the fact that those documents may no longer be relevant or may have less relevance than they did when they were originally drafted. The other, I think, observation that I'd make about the precinct approach to character is that very rarely will all parts of that precinct accurately reflect the statement of preferred future character. And you'll find pockets of development that really display a different character, or where built form character has evolved in such a way as to be really quite different or distinct from other parts of the precinct. And so in that respect, it's often easier to convince decision makers that that part of the precinct doesn't display the characteristics outlined in the preferred character statement. And that tends to then undermine the achievement of the overall character statement for the precinct as a whole. As I said before too, the presence of these character statements really can lead to derivative or ticker box design, and that will occur despite the practice note calling for innovation. Now again, that in some respects, some participants might view that outcome as being a strength of the system rather than a weakness. Some may feel that the establishment of consistent streetscapes displaying derivative designs are in fact exactly what the doctor ordered. Bring it on, they might say. And indeed, some jurisdictions, both in Australia and internationally, privilege exactly that sort of an outcome. So I think probably it's time for us as a profession to start to express a view about what we think as a profession is the way to move forward. Do we think that derivative designs are not only acceptable but desirable outcomes, or rather would we prefer to see streetscapes that are more diverse, more interesting, where design is more innovative and less derivative? Now, these are big questions, and these are exactly, I think, the sort of concepts that we need to grapple with as a profession as we move confidently into this decade. The other issue that we also find too when we're doing our on-the-ground assessments is that the built form character of areas changes very often in response to matters that are in response to developments that aren't captured by the planning system. And here, of course, I'm talking about single dwellings that don't require a planning permit and that can be built really without any kind of consideration of neighbourhood character at all. Now, again, some might feel that that's a good thing or a bad thing, and I'm not going to pass judgment on it as an idea. But of course, what it does mean is that the character of an area may well change and change quite quickly in response to that outcome. And of course, it seems to make little sense to then expect medium density development to be constrained to a different type of assessment outcome if in fact it's surrounded by or dominated by a street character that displays none of the preferred characteristics outlined in a council policy or precinct brochure. So it's a significant challenge for the system to respond to, in my view. The other issue, of course, too, is where does neighbourhood character now fit within an overall strategic picture in terms of housing change? The recently released practice note, Planning Practice Note 90, starts to put neighbourhood character in a context. And of course, if you look at the information in that practice note, neighbourhood character is but one input into the matrix of housing change considerations. So these days, I think that there's an encouragement, indeed, I think a requirement to place neighbourhood character more clearly within a scenario that has regard to things like housing strategy, regional, metropolitan and regional growth plans, the structure of planning schemes, and here I'm talking about other VPP tools and the content and structure of zones are all considerations now for how neighbourhood character would be reflected in planning schemes. So I think it's clear that, that in future, neighbourhood character as a concept will need to be considered on a more holistic and integrated way, and that the idea of character for character's sake will not be sustainable moving forward. Clearly, a component of every housing strategy now will be informed by the municipal and regional housing strategy, as well as other issues that we're more familiar with, things like heritage, environmental, landscape and land capability constraints. Will all be considerations about that will inform how we develop a residential development framework for a municipality. So too, those concepts of strategy and using character as an implementation tool for strategy will continue to be relevant moving forward in the system. So expect to see, terms like minimal, incremental and substantial change will remain, I think, relevant ideas moving forward in a VPP environment. And using a neighbourhood character will continue to be an important concept to achieve those strategic outcomes. So, for example, we will still be able to use neighbourhood character as a means of establishing a preferred character and to achieve substantial change in the same way that we might be able to use the concept of respect for existing character as a way of delivering minimal change in an area where we are more interested in protecting that existing neighbourhood character as distinct from planning for intensification, which is what we'd like to do in areas where we want to see substantial change. Moving forward, what's good practice? Well, anybody who's been involved in the PPF translation process will understand that the new structure will contain less words. The municipal planning strategy and the policies that will sit in the front part of the planning scheme at clauses 11 to 19 will be brief, certainly briefer than what we've been used to. And so there's going to be a need for the drafters of those documents to really be concise, clear in their language, and to be able to express clearly and briefly what it is that they're seeking to achieve. In some cases, local councils may feel that the guidance provided in state and regional policy will be sufficient, and there will be no need for expressions of local built form, guidance on local built form character in the local sections of the PPF. I think too, it's clear that the role played by zone schedules is becoming far more important. And as a consequence, the zone schedules, not policy, will do more of the heavy lifting when it comes to providing guidance on how decision makers will be exercising their discretion. The role of the zone then will become far more important in the new environment moving forward than it has in the past. And I mean that in terms of its ability to express neighbourhood character objectives, to include decision guidelines, as well as to add local metrics for some of the res code variations in relation to things like side and rear boundary setbacks, walls on boundaries, landscaping and the like. Similarly too, I think if a council is about to embark on a neighbourhood character strategy or a review of its current strategy and its policy settings in that regard, they will need to very clearly express and establish a relationship between housing strategy and character as part of that exercise. No longer will, in my view, the department accept scenarios where precinct brochures might include activity centres or neighbourhood character or neighbourhood centres within a precinct, but then fail to distinguish between the built form outcomes that would be expected as a consequence of those strategic settings. Now, what we're really seeing in the system at the moment is effectively and quite reasonably a continued evolution of the previous directions. So this is really what we're seeing, I think, is evolutionary change. But let's imagine a scenario where perhaps we might consider revolutionary change. Does the system that we have grown so used to and are so comfortable and familiar with require a rethink? Now, these views are meant to be controversial, meant to provoke thought amongst our leaders in the profession and among statutory and strategic planners who are at the coalface of this debate. I'll be very interested to hear what your thoughts are at the end of this, and you might have some idea of your own about how the system could be rebranded. We run a number of these neighbourhood character strategies, half day or full day, for Pierre and for Addo. And one of the themes that comes out of those sessions is often a feeling, I think, amongst many of the younger planners in the profession about really whether the system encourages innovation in building design or not. And I think there's grounds to for them to believe that really the system at the moment caters more, well, encourages in many instances derivative design rather than innovative design. Now, it would might interest the younger members of the profession to note that the previous assessment framework tools that I introduced you to before, well, they actually went out and encouraged design that was innovative. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see element 3 of the Good Design Guide, which is a 1995 document, and element 3, objective 2, was to encourage innovative contemporary design, which make designs which make a positive contribution to the character of the neighbourhood. The exhibited Res Code consultation draft perhaps went down that same path by saying that preference should be given to subdivision and residential design that is innovative rather than imitative. I think that they're quite clear expressions in a statutory system that would perhaps make clear what it is that we're seeking to achieve. If we mean that we want innovation in design, well then perhaps the planning schemes should come out and say that. Now, the current system that we see, so many requirements. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but in a scenario where we've got a range of mandatory built form controls on things like number of stories, building height, garden area, and other requirements around things like street setback, site coverage, and so on. How relevant then is neighbourhood character in those scenarios? On the extract of a zone schedule on the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see the level of detail that exists in terms of built form and siting requirements that have been developed to reflect the local character of that particular area. Now, if in fact we think that neighbourhood character is really an issue of height, setback, spacing, and landscaping, if they're perhaps some of the main components of neighbourhood character, on what basis then do we think neighbourhood character remains relevant in that context? I wonder that when we talk about character in a context where the built form parameters of new development have been so precisely set out, what we're really meaning is design detail. And so design detail is that component of Res Code that sits up the back at standard B31. And it talks about designs as design detail that encourages, that respects the existing or preferred neighbourhood character. And then really it's starting to delve into the detail of the buildings, the facade articulation, the window and door proportions, the roof form, verandas, eaves and parapets. And similarly, design detail also talks about the design and placement of car accommodation and its integration with the facade of the development. So perhaps we've reached a stage of specificity where really character is dealt with quite well by the introduction of detailed local values into the Res Code, into the schedules of the neighbourhood residential zone and the general residential zone. In that case, perhaps an argument could be made that character as a concept is less relevant, perhaps even redundant. Discretionary uses and character are always an interesting part of the built form assessment matrix. Rhetorically, why do service stations need to meet character tests? Now, there are a variety of Section 1 and Section 2 uses that can be built in residential zones, yet many character policies actively require those built forms, the built forms associated with those uses, to be assessed against local character policy. Now, how possible is that, I wonder, for some of them, when the very fabric of that activity will inevitably be inconsistent at almost every level with the preferred character statement of an area. Does it make sense to assess a childcare centre or a service station, for instance, against the residential neighbourhood character policy that might sit at clause 21? What sort of difficulties do we have from an assessment perspective in trying to make that development fit within those policy settings? Is it appropriate now to start to rethink whether they're the sorts of developments that should be captured by those policies as we move into a new PPF translation format? Have we got the settings right? It's interesting, isn't it, that character remains a consideration in clause 55 for assessments in the residential growth zone. And here we're talking about perhaps establishing a preferred character rather than respect for existing character. But in the commercial one zone, remember, we've got to have regard to the decision guidelines. In the decision guidelines, we have to consider the objectives, standards and decision guidelines of clause 54 and 55, which call up character. Is it appropriate in some zones to provide the provide the planning authority with the opportunity to turn character off? Now, we can turn off other requirements in zone schedules like building height. We could add in another height or those types of things. Should it be possible for planning authorities to be able to switch off the character settings of Res Code, particularly in scenarios where we think that that might add clarity to the assessment framework? Now, I know we could continue to rely on preferred character as a way of delivering a built form outcome in those circumstances. So I get that, but I just wonder whether it's an issue that is too complicated and too complex and unnecessary to be required to be dealt with in that way in all circumstances. So, some food for thought there. Now, I'll leave you with this. We've used character as an assessment concept in planning schemes or in documents referred to by planning schemes since really 1995. It has been a technique that has served this industry admirably. It's been a flexible way of encouraging site responsive design and encouraging and indeed requiring designers to have regard to the characteristics of the neighbourhood into which they plan to introduce a new development. The VITCO 2 Advisory Committee talked about the need to retain a concept like character to ensure that development occurred in a way that met and or managed communities' expectations about change. And in that respect, it's probably been a successful concept. On the other hand, we're in 2020 and our planet it certainly faces significant challenges. Those challenges are obvious to us all, but of course, the challenges posed by global climate change and the impact that that will have to the built form of cities is certainly preeminent in our thinking here at Addo and Glossop. I think also we could ask ourselves, really, in the hierarchy of things, does character continue to justify its preeminence? Is character still the mandatory starting point for assessment? Now, arguably, character was an incredibly important concept in 1995 and in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where residential zones were, and decisions made under the residential zone were almost entirely policy driven. That is to say, there was little or almost no ability in most planning schemes for planning authorities to express and articulate local requirements around things like siting, height and design. The settings have changed, haven't they, recently, and what we now see is the proliferation of zone schedules that contain large amounts of local variations to the Res Code standards that really require a much different built form outcome through the statutory tool rather than through the policy tool. We've also seen too the advent of things like mandatory garden area and mandatory building heights, which again, I think tend to mean that policy is not as important as it used to be in a scenario where there were no ways to control built form effectively through the zone itself. Perhaps the other criticism about neighbourhood character is really the fact that even though we've been using it since 1995, it still remains a widely misunderstood term, I think both in the industry and outside it. It's often derisively referred to as the vibe by its proponents and sometimes too by its adherents. And the level of subjectivity around the achievement of the neighbourhood character objective is both a strength and a weakness of the system. I believe it's a strength in that it certainly allows room for participants, decision makers to engage in a debate with each other about the appropriateness or otherwise of a design. And it certainly gives us the space to have that debate. On the other hand, it's certainly a confusing term for local communities who perhaps don't understand the sophistication and nuance in the way that we apply the concept of neighbourhood character to our residential assessment framework. And in that respect, I can't really blame them for being confused, given the language that we've adopted, the way in which we've chosen to implement neighbourhood character. Effectively, we use, as I've said before, we use neighbourhood character as a concept to achieve minimal change all the way through to substantial change. And so I think for communities, that's that smacks of us being, a bit too tricky by half. And so I think we've got a scenario where some in the profession and in the community have taken the view that neighbourhood character is now so subjective that the outcomes are now too random. On the other hand, in some areas, some might think that with the detailed level of prescription in some neighbourhood character precinct brochures, that rather the built forms outcomes are effectively predetermined, and there will be applicants that understand how to meet those, satisfy those directions in design, and they do it through copying other design. So that might then, an outcome of that might be that it leads to streetscapes that are populated by new development that tends to look much the same as the development next door, because people understand, well, that's the easy way to get a planning permit. Now, if we were to get rid of neighbourhood character, and I'm not suggesting necessarily that we do, it does beg the question, well, what takes its place? And in that respect, that's a topic that I'll leave to my audience, and I look forward to your comments, both now on the chat and later on the website. I'll have a look at some of the comments and I'll try to answer some of them as we go. But certainly what we'd like you to do is to leave your comments on the chat. You can leave them anonymously if you wish. And we intend to release those comments in our upcoming blog to just encourage some discussion and debate within the industry. Hey, Charlotte, do you want to go through some of those comments and questions?
Yeah, well, why don't you have a look through the chat and see if you want to answer any of them now before we clock off.
Sure. There's a question about whether Vic Code 2 and the Good Design Guides are easily accessible. What we might do there is present some links to where you might find those, and Charlotte will find them. I've got hard copies of them, but that's not going to do you much good out there in webinar land. So I'll get back to you on that. Yep, can require a, Emily, I think it said, you can require a single dwelling permit under the neighbourhood character overlay. And where does this overlay fit in? I reckon that's a really good question, Emma, because the neighbourhood character overlay, I think, has been a tool that has been up until now rather sparingly used. And I think it's mostly been used in circumstances where planning authorities have sought to really minimise change and to apply really quite prescriptive rules. And I think the Stonnington planning scheme is an example of that. But that's a very interesting topic about perhaps the ability of the NCO to call up planning permits for single dwellings. The challenge, of course, is that you won't be able, I don't think, to apply a neighbourhood character overlay across a municipality to call up single dwellings. And I think it still needs to be very highly targeted in order to be successful, both at panel and at the departmental level. Another question was that it's interesting that innovation had formerly been incorporated into the planning schemes, and that if we do it again, we might need to define it. I hear you on that one. It certainly does make it, we do like to play with words, don't we, as planners? Someone's put a comment that said that New South Wales bases it more on empirical formula, including density, and that it's easier to design to those requirements than on a subjective vague test. And I think that's an interesting comment because a feature of the Victorian system through the its decision to rely on neighbourhood character studies and other performance-based tests has really meant that there's a quite a high level of subjectivity in our assessment framework. And I think that's both a strength and a weakness of our system. Idiana said, how effective have neighbourhood character statements been? Are these good or bad? And I think the effectiveness of neighbourhood character statements really probably depends on who you ask and what position you might be looking at that question from. So I think to an extent, neighbourhood character statements have been helpful in articulating what some of the characteristics of character might be, and then perhaps how they might be reflected in new development. But I think where they've been less successful is in allowing some sort of design latitude in some areas, perhaps being overly prescriptive in terms of the outcome that they seek. And of course, too, leading statutory planners in particular to adopt a ticker box method to design assessment, which may or may not lead to a good design outcome at the end of the day. So I think, Eddie, and the question is, they're probably good and bad. Charlotte, I think that might be the end of the question, and I've got a nice comment there from Eloise. Thank you for that, Eloise. I appreciate your sentiments.
All right, thanks so much, John. That was great. And thanks everyone for sitting in, and I hope you all learned a few things along the way, and hopefully we'll see you at one of our future sessions. So have a great day. Charlotte, just before you go, I just wanted to remind people on the chat at the moment that Addo has got a half-day program coming up called A Test of Character. That'll be a longer version of this session, which we'd encourage you to attend, and we'll dive into the issue of character in more detail. And Charlotte, I think that's running on the 17th of June and places are still available. Correct. You can register on our website if you're interested in that program. And make sure you look out for the rest of our KIT programs. We hope you find them interesting, and thank you for attending today's session. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks, John. Thanks, Charlotte.